I feel the same way. I'm not head anymore, so that's the same thing. Became familiar with Anoop's work very early on, early 90s. So when I started reading his dissertation, that was a groundbreaking work on A/A bar movement, scrambling, and all those things that I was very interested in. For more than a decade, I followed him, everything he wrote on specificity, on scrambling, movement, all those binding type of things, all those things. And I have to say that I really learned a lot from his vision, and he contributed a lot to my own work, and so that's an additional personal touch on me being happy to introduce him today. So he has moved on from scrambling, I guess, sort of, as I did. And his work these days is more concentrated on case and activity. And today, actually, he's going to talk about complex predicates and case. So he has worked on, his interests are on pre-nominative clauses, word order, and PP positions. He has published on accusative and ergative in Hindi, quantification in Hindi, structural case and reconstruction, ergatives, antipassives, and overt life verbs in Hindi, word order and remnant BP movement. I think at some point all syntacticians at UCLA were working on BP remnant BP constructions. I don't want to take more time of his time. His talk today is two types of complex predicates and case in Hindi. Please join me to welcome Anoop Mahajan. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for coming. That was a very generous introduction. I'm especially thankful to you all to come out and listen to a talk that's not on an Iranian language. I am a distant cousin, though, but Hindi doesn't have the cool stuff that you guys talk about all the time, like the izafe and prepositions and all sorts of good stuff that Persian has. But we do have a specificity marker of the sort that Persian does have. And it actually, I learned, so coming here was beneficial for me because I learned certain facts about Hindi by listening to the talks in Persian, like especially about the distribution of the indirect objects and direct objects. That's sort of new way of thinking about Hindi for me. And I suspect that's sort of the interaction that one wants, that we want to be able to figure out stuff in our language through insights of other languages. That's sort of a common thing that happens. So when I was asked to come to give a talk here, I sort of tried to figure out what to say which would interest at least some of you. And since I've been doing a little bit of work on complex predicates, that's not my sort of central, was not my central interest in my early work. But I've been looking at complex predicates, especially from the perspective of case, where my interest was largely to understand the distribution of ergative case and possibly a theory of ergative case. And I started looking at complex predicates in Hindi, which have interesting properties with respect to case. And I decided to talk about that. But then, much of the stuff that I'd done on complex predicates actually involved VV predicates. These are sort of what looks like serial verbs, but they're not. These are real, true light verb constructions that are strung together. So you get a bare verb stem that is followed by a light verb their verb stem of a verb that's followed by another verb, which is a regular heavy verb in the language, but functions like a light verb with respect to the familiar properties of light verbs. And that's where I'll start today. I mean, that's sort of, you know, look at those and then make a transition to NV, the familiar Persian type light verb constructions, and suggest that there is a parallel. I do not want to give an impression that their grammar is identical, but there are sort of striking parallels in the grammar, especially with respect to case. Now, when you look at the case patterns of Hindi and Persian, obviously, you know, there's a mismatch there. Hindi is an ergative language and Persian is not. And Persian case is, I think, of a very different nature than Hindi case. But on the other hand, in Iranian languages, there are languages that have ergativity, and it might be interesting to compare the data. I intend to do that at some point when I sort of get more access to the materials. All right, so let's also, I mean, much of the talk is going to be about subject case as opposed to what you guys do, which is largely about the object case. I sort of start off with the basic examples here in 1, 2, 3. That sort of one is from Persian to just get you interested here, and after that I will not give you any more Persian data. Then 2 and 3 are sort of the cases that I will focus on. So 2 is the case that is parallel to the Persian complex predicates that you're familiar with, and 3 is the case that I just described, that you get these VV constructions. These are actually called compound verbs in Hindi linguistics, but the term compound is completely misleading. I mean, these are not compounds in any reasonable sense. They are very productive. I mean, that's one thing that Hindi does share with Persian is the fact that simple verbs have relatively little use. Much of the predication is done with complex predicates. Either VV compounds are probably, or when I say compounds, you know, I'm using the terminology that's old, but these VV complex predicates are probably more common than the NV complex predicates, though at least with the verb do, the NV predicates outnumber everything else. I mean, the verb do is so productive. It combines with, you know, zillions of nouns to give you complex predicates. In fact, there's a major piece of scholarship in Hindi that goes back to the 70s, where linguist Kalicharan Behal wrote a 2-volume book on just do as a light verb in complex predicates. That's scholarship for you. And, just spend your lifetime working on do in one language. Okay, so the major sort of goal of the talk is, though, sort of I'm preaching to people who already know what is coming, that light verbs are not that light. I mean, they actually have these properties. And in this case, I'll sort of focus on these case assigning properties that they display, which they clearly get from their heavy counterparts. They're just parallel properties that are inherited by these light verbs. And I'll sort of implement that in this analysis that I will give. And these case properties, just to give you a glimpse of it from the NV complex predicates, are displayed in 4 to 6 here. So 4, where you get, so there's, the thing to pay attention to is the case marking here. So 4 has an ergative subject, and then co-marked object, which is a DOM object. And then you have the complex predicate, noun yad, and the word to. In 5, we, instead of, if you look at the meaning of 4 to 6, it's largely the same meaning, but you get 3 case alternations. So in 5, you get a dative subject, so with a dative marker, instead of the ergative of 4. And in 6, you get a nominative construction, though it's aspectually a different construction. So 4 and 5 were perfective and 6 is not. But you see the alteration. You can, in one case, you get ergative, in another case, you get dative, and then in the third case, you get nominative, and they largely mean the same thing. Okay. There are some differences, but for most parts, they look very similar. Okay. So I'll come back to that. I'll spend the next few minutes talking about the VV compounds or VV complex predicates. As I said, they are extremely productive. I mean, if you sort of listen to people, pretty much every other sentence contains them. If you look at a corpus, there are like, you know, lots of instances of these kind of constructions that you find. So they're completely productive and commonly used. They have been extensively studied in Hindi linguistics. So people have put in a lot of, I'm talking about the VV ones as opposed to the NV ones, for which I mentioned that there's a single author who's written a lot of stuff on a single verb. But in this part of the grammar, what we find is that the language has a relatively small set of verbs that actually function as light verbs. By small, I mean in my own language, I think I use maybe about a dozen or so light verbs. People who've done serious counting, like Peter Hook, who wrote an excellent book on this topic, counted this for different people, different grammarians, and counted the range from 8 to whatever, 51. I think 51 is a little excessive in the sense that that's the point where people sort of stop making a distinction between complex predicate and normal sort of object verb construction. But the number is it's not a very small number, and they are very productive. These things sort of combine with a lot of heavy verbs, so to speak, and you get you know, fairly productive system of complex predicates out of these. Okay, so just to give you an example of where they fit, look at 8 and 9. 8 doesn't have a complex predicate, so that's a simple verb to buy, kharidi. And you will find many, the Persian speakers will find many lexical items here that you will recognize immediately. That's not an accident. And in 9, you see VV complex predicate, and all you do is the first verb appears in the stem form, and the light verb takes the inflection of the sentence. So you get the aspect, and in other cases, you also get tense in these cases. Most of my examples would be perfective, and you can drop the copula in those cases, so you won't see the tense being grammatically present in these sentences. An interesting thing, and this is sort of why this, you know, why I got to this, was that light verbs actually play a role in case assignment. And so the easiest sort of case to look at here would be as illustrated in the paradigm 10 to 12. So you get an alternation here. So in 10, the light verb is a transitive verb. Okay. Oh, just a word about Hindi ergativity. I suspect many of you already know about this, that Hindi perfectivity is a split, Hindi ergativity is a aspect-based split. So you get transitive perfective subjects that are marked with ergative marker, which is ne, and with unaccusatives, you never get ergative marking. So that's sort of classical ergativity, but it is aspect-based split that you see in these cases. So I'll keep the aspect constant, usually just use the perfective paradigms to illustrate the ergative pattern in these sentences. So in 10, you see that light verb is transitive, and you get the ergative subject. If you swap the verb, the light verb, to an unaccusative, as I do in 11, the sentence basically retains its meaning, but it's completely ungrammatical. And when you that you see by looking at 13, where you remove the ergative and the sentence is perfect. So basically, both 10 and 12 look like transitive sentences, right? They have two arguments, and they're, at least the translation that I give you here is identical. And the major difference here is the case marking on the subject. There is another difference that I will sort of ignore today, which is in agreement in these cases. In ergative constructions, you get object agreement if the object happens to be not overtly case inflected or case marked. Otherwise, you get third person singular. But in 13, what you get is essentially a subject agreement. The subject is unmarked, and therefore you get agreement. It's not going to play any role in what I do today, but that's sort of something that you might, when you're looking at those gender agreement morphology, you might sort of have questions about it. All right, so we've already gotten to a stage where we can draw a very simple conclusion here that in transitive perfective sentences, the transitive verb, if the transitive verb is if the verb is transitive, then you get an ergative subject. And if the verb is unaccusative, I sometimes say intransitive here, there is an issue as to whether it's unaccusative. There is any distinction between unaccusatives and unergatives, and there is. But I'll sort of set that aside for now. So it looks like by looking at 10 to 12 that the V2, the light verb, actually plays a role in assignment of ergative case. When I started working on this, I was sort of invested in this debate about the nature of ergative case, meaning whether it is some kind of inherent case or dependent case in the sense of Marantz and Baker. And therefore, I sort of looked for data which was not sort of commonly discussed, which could help us settle the issue. And that's the data that we're going to look at next. But before we get to that, I just want, I have this aside in which is illustrated in sentences 13 to 16, which is fairly straightforward. You guys know this, and I don't really have to convince anybody here that these are the things we're talking about are not lexical compounds. You can split them, you can do whatever I've done. You can sort of put negation, you can split them by movement, split them by putting intervening material. You can, the light verb, the heavy verb can be causativized inside the light verb, as shown in 15, for example, and in 16 you sort of see shared constituency that leaves out the light verb. So it looks like light verb is an independent animal, right? It's not really in a compound in lexical sense with the heavy verb here. Okay. Okay. So the next argument is going to be essentially based on these exceptions that I found. So while it is true that transitive perfectives usually take ergative subjects, there are these exceptions to this in Hindi that are sometimes noted, but you know, they're sort of cataloged and people don't worry about them. But I found a use for those in the sense that those exceptions actually let us ask the question as to where the ergative case comes from. Okay? And the evidence that I have here seems to point towards a conclusion that in light verb constructions, it's the light verb, right? I've already said that, but now you get real arguments for that by looking at the exceptions. These exceptions, they're multiple exceptions. There's another sort of reason that I looked at these exceptions, because if there are exceptions, then they have to be lexically coded somehow. And then if you sort of find the patterns where exceptions govern the case, then you can make a case for, you can make an argument for ergative case being inherent in the sense that it's, at least in some cases, tied to exceptions, right? So that has to be coded someplace, and that's got to be in the lexical entry someplace. So there are these verbs that behave in a strange pattern. So I'll give you two instances of these. The first involves the verb to understand. That's in 17 and 18. This verb is exceptional in the sense that while it does take ergative case imperfective, it doesn't have to. So 17 and 18 are equally good for many speakers, including me. So in my Hindi, they're sort of basically mean exactly the same thing. Might be some, I mean, if there is a difference, then it's too subtle to sort of enter the picture, at least for now. But what you do is now we know that this verb, so much understand when it's used by itself, it is exceptional in the sense that it allows for nominative subjects, okay? Or it doesn't require an ergative subject, and therefore the subject sort of becomes nominative by whatever licenses the nominative case in the system. So what I do then is that I add a light verb to understand and make sure that that light verb is not exceptional. So that light verb requires an ergative subject, and that's shown in 19. So you have Kabir ne paise liye, Kabir took the money, you have to have the ergative. So liye is standard transitive verb that imperfective must have an ergative subject. And then I add this non-exceptional verb to so much to form the complex predicate. And the point is that the option that we had to assign ergative case with understand disappears. Okay, so now you have to have the subject in ergative case. Okay, so look at 20, subject has to be ergative, and then if you, so that's sort of kind of the critical discovery here, that the optionality of ergativity that understood or understands or displayed, that just completely disappears as soon as you add this verb, which is not negotiable with respect to ergative case assignment. Right? So the conclusion is fairly straightforward, that it's the light verb that is assigning or doing whatever sort of is needed to make sure that the subject is ergative, and the heavy verb is not involved in ergative case assignment at all. Okay? With an unaccusative verb with so much, then you would predict, obviously from what we've already seen, that given that unaccusatives don't assign ergative case, you would expect that the subject will not have an ergative when you get the transitive counterpart of 20 as in 21. And that happens to be true. So 21 has a nominative subject. If you try to make it make the subject ergative, then you have an ungrammatical 22. Okay? And just to sort of make sure that I illustrate that the verb go cannot have ergative subject, which is kind of obvious because, I mean, if there's a definition for ergativity, then it is that unaccusatives don't take ergative subjects. And that's true in Hindi in 23. Right. Okay, so the big point here, ergative case must be coming from the light verb. Right? The exception class 2 here in 24, and that's verb milna. And in this case, this is a verb which is exceptional, that it disallows ergative subjects. So, you know, put it in perfective, stick it in a transitive sentence, and it will not tolerate an ergative subject as shown in 25. So you get nominative as you see in 24. So it's sort of, you know, there's really no way to predict what's going to happen. It's just has to be coded someplace in the lexical entry of Milna that I don't like ergative subjects. So I mean, and that's kind of significant in the sense that that is something that you can code under inherent case marking. Okay, because inherent case can appeal to semantic roles, and therefore, you know, there, you know, exceptions could be coded somehow in the grammar in that system, which is sort of hard to see how to do that in dependent case marking. I'll come back to that. I mean, I have a sort of sub-agenda here, which is to sort of argue against dependent case as such. And dependent case for ergativity, at least, you know, like the system that Baker has been arguing for in recent years. So when you put Milna in a complex predicate situation, I keep the second verb constant here, Lena, so that we know that that requires an ergative subject. And in 26, we sort of put Lena as the light verb, so you get Mil-Lia as the complex predicate, and you see that you get ergative subject here. So remember, Mil cannot be the source of ergative, so it has to be the light verb in this case. So that's the point. So 27 shows that if you try to take the ergative marker and put the subject in nominative, it's completely ungrammatical. Very few things in Hindi are completely ungrammatical. These are. So the data is fairly robust and clear. And there's now, I mean, you know, in many cases, as you've seen, that the position of object in Persian, same holds for Hindi and so on. There's quibbling about the data depending on the interpretation, for example. Nothing of that sort will work here. I mean, you can do whatever you like with respect to interpretation. The star sentences are just solidly ungrammatical here. There are, so, you know, the point again, I mean, it's very simple. The one that I made here, that it's the light verb that is involved in the assignment of ergative case, and therefore we should be building a system in which ergative case licensing is assigned to sort of light verbs and not to heavy verbs, at least in complex predicate construction. And then you could potentially ask me what happens if there is no light verb in those cases, and my answer will be that there is none, but there is a light verb shell in those cases, and there's a special treatment required for those cases. Okay, so the conclusion is given after the point after 27, but you know, it's sort of reasonably clear, I think, data-wise where this is going. So I sort of said something about dependent case, so let me sort of say a few more words, and then probably I can ignore it because that's not the focus of the talk. There's been this recent sort of push towards arguing that there is a notion of dependent case that can possibly completely determine ergativity. Okay, so in the terms of case competition, so basically if you have two DPs within a single domain, you can basically set up a competition, and in an ergative language, the higher of the DPs in terms of C command gets ergative case. Okay, so and in those cases, split ergativity would have to be handled as I see it. This is the gambit that was introduced by Itziar Laka in her work from BASC, that when you get the split ergativity in BASC, then that means you're dealing with biclausal constructions where ergativity sort of is doesn't come into the play because the arguments don't belong to the same clause, okay, so to speak. Okay, and this is sort of developed in detail by Jessica Kuhn in her work. So I call it Laka gambit to deal with ergative case assignment. That is actually plausible way of working, but it's sort of very unclear how to do that with the cases that I've given you. You know, so the way you would have to go about it is to say that when you have an unaccusative light verb, then it introduces a complementation which is which introduces a phase, and then the subject is out of that phase and therefore doesn't enter case competition. It'll take a lot of legwork to implement that. It may be doable, but it'll take a lot of work in order to show empirically that it's actually motivated. So that's a bit of a challenge for dependent case marking. And as I sort of said that, what happens here is only in a limit. The exceptions that you find are sort of relatively limited. And you would have to say in those exceptional cases that they have a different clause structure. And that doesn't seem to have any other evidence for it, no semantic sort of effects that you can latch on to motivate structural differences and so on. So it's something that somebody should probably take up. Maybe I will too at some point, just to do the, settle the argument that, I mean, I don't know whether it's doable or not, but it's worth sort of thinking about it, given this push that is coming from ergative, the dependent case theory of ergative, that all ergative case. I mean, Baker sort of starts off with a relatively weaker position that inherent case could be dependent or ergative case could be dependent or inherent, which is of course kind of very disappointing kind of way to think about it. But then he expresses hope that maybe all of it is dependent, and in a paper with Jonathan Bawaljek, he sort of shows how to go about it. I mean, it's an interesting line of reasoning, but I'm sort of presenting data here, which would be challenging for that theory. Okay. All right. So analysis to this, it's fairly straightforward, right? We want basically the light group to assign the ergative case, and what I do here is shown in these little trees on the next page. Okay, so what I am suggesting here is when the light verb is transitive, and this ergative sort of seems sort of, I should have changed it to transitive. Then it assigns ergative case to the subject, and the construction that we have here, I suggest that it's a control construction, so that the thematic role is for the external argument is coming from the lower VP shell, and it's assigned to pro, and the subject is getting case marked in the light verb shell higher up. And there was an issue as to, if you do that, is subject actually getting some kind of thematic role from the light verb as well? I'm not opposed to it. I mean, I'm sort of think there is probably something that could be said about that, because in many cases, transitive light verbs seem to impart some kind of additional agentivity to the subject, which may be built into this system somehow. I'm not sure how one would do that. So otherwise, it's a fairly straightforward proposal. That, but it does something interesting, which I think has not been done before, which is that it makes a case that there is a separation of the case domains and thematic domains. Okay, so the lower part, the lower VP is the thematic domain, where all the theta roles are assigned, and the higher VP, which is headed by this light verb, that has nothing to do with actual sort of theta role assignment to the arguments. They might, the subject argument might acquire something additional in the higher position, but it's, basic core theta role is coming lower down in the structure. And then the structure on the right here is the one with the unaccusative light verbs. Okay, so the structures are parallel. I mean, they sort of look very similar, except for the fact that I'm suggesting here that what is involved with the light verbs that are unaccusative are raising structures. Okay, so you get raising from this position. And this is, remember, this is the thematic position. So the theta roles remain constant across the two subject positions in these trees. And then the subject moves from this position to the higher position. But the unaccusative verb obviously doesn't assign any case. And therefore, the subject is left without a case and will have to get a case from outside, which basically is going to be the nominative case in that case from the higher domain. But it takes care of the case differences. The problematic parts of this are kind of obvious. That I mean, there's kind a virtue of this analysis because it's also sort of gives you a connection with the fact that you're getting raising here into a position, and we know that inherent case is usually not assigned under raising, right? You don't get it inherent case in a derived position because the derived position is not thematic in that sense. In this case, the verb is unaccusative, so that's clearly not a thematic position. And the bad thing here is that I actually don't really have very clear evidence that distinguishes raising from control. Two actually bad things, so I might as well fess up here. One is that the structures are parallel. You might think that the control and raising structures are different in terms of the complexity of the complement, right? In control cases, you get CPs, and in raising cases, you get TPs and so on, and I'm not doing that. Maybe it can be done, not so worried about it. I don't really have any sort of states and theories of control as such, but things could get changed a little bit if we ask serious questions as to the motivation for control versus raising, which I sort of tried to play with various things. The structure is small, so it's hard to sort of use the diagnostics that you use to distinguish control from raising. So I tried to use, standard quantifiers and so on and so forth that just don't give good results as such. All right, so I'm gonna leave that aside and move on to stuff that you guys will probably find more exciting, which is the NV compounds. So basically what I want to say is that whatever I've said here about VV complex predicates, that holds for NV complex predicates as well. Meaning in those cases also, the case is determined by the verb, and the theta roles are determined by the nominal. And there's less work on this topic in Hindi than there is in Persian. There is significant work done by Miriam Butt in this domain, but there are relatively few people who've done stuff that is theoretical in nature. So there's descriptive work that I referred to earlier, but it's sort of a domain which needs to be studied a bit more, and maybe with an eye towards Persian, so that we can sort of learn what you guys have already discovered. The list of light verbs that participate in NV complex predicates is probably the same size as the list for VV complex predicates, but it's not identical. So it would have been nice if it was exactly the same list, but it's not. In fact, the most productive light verb in NV predicates is do, which actually does not appear in VV complex predicates. Okay? There has to be a deep reason for that, and I am not going to talk about what it could be. I don't really know. Okay. Again, these NV complex predicates are not compounds, as you guys know. So you can split them, you can put stuff in between, and so on. So these are completely syntactic constructions. So nothing lexical about them. They're in fact even more productive in certain ways than VVs. VVs, remember the list of the light verbs is relatively small, and not all the heavy verbs participate in VV complex predicates. But with NV predicates, the list of nouns is an open class. And it's sort of, you can have Google do, you can have Facebook do, Twitter do, and so on and so forth. You can keep on adding nouns. So in that sense, these are very productive. Okay, just to very quickly now look at the case distribution. It's going to be, there are no surprises here. It's going to mimic the case patterns that we've seen earlier. So look at 3031, and when the light verb is transitive, you have to have a ergative subject. So you get Kabir ne Mohan ko bahut yaad kiya. That's 30. So you get ne. If you leave out ne, then you are in trouble. And again, the grammaticality judgments here are robust. I mean, there's no quibbling about those. And then the argument goes, once again, sort of looks for lexical exceptions as to what they do. And they function just the way that VV complex predicates did. And here I use a different light verb, which is lana, which is to bring. Okay? It looks a little bit like lena, but they mean very different things. Lana is to bring, lena is to take. This light verb is so there's actually the reason I paused is there's a missing sentence in the paradigm, which is supposed to show that lana does not take ergative subject when it's imperfective. So it's completely not compatible with the ergative subjects, and that's a lexical exception, right? So that's lana is one of those verbs which lexically stipulates that I shall not take an ergative subject, okay? And that's the example that should have gone before 32. But now that you know what that example is, now look at 32 and 33, and that shows that when you add lana to a noun to form an NV complex predicate, you cannot have ergative subject. Okay, so that's completely banned, which is the property of lana. I mean, in this case, nouns don't even have anything to do with the ergative case assignment, but at least now you can look at the light verb and see that when the light verb is incompatible with the ergative assignment, then you don't get ergative subjects. Again, it's predicted that when the light verb is unaccusative, then the NV complex predicate will disallow ergative subjects, and that's what happens in 34. I'm gonna skip this aside here. This was just some information about how the NV complex predicate function, particularly noun, which can take its own arguments in various ways, like in genitive and or with oblique case and so on. Just going on to the structure now for sentences involving NV complex predicates. So look at 37. Here the noun is used. Okay, it's borrowed, right? Some people can probably see it. So Kabir ne veh auzar istemal kiya. Kabir used that tool, and you get ergative subject because of do, which takes an ergative subject. It is not an exceptional verb. And I'm suggesting that the tree that follows 37 is the structure, which basically mimics the structure that I gave earlier, except for the fact that the inner shell now, the lower shell, is an NP. Okay, called it small NP because in this case the noun is such. It's not. Many of the nouns that are used in NV constructions are experiencer nouns. This one is not, and therefore I just kept the parallel complete here. And I'm sort of suggesting that essentially this is again a control structure. It's in line with what I said earlier. And this keeping in, that there's sort of a reason why I do that, and that is 38, which is parallel to 37. So if you look at the two sentences, they share some sort of, pretty much everything except for the fact that the noun here is an experiencer noun. So you get memory here. And I'm suggesting what's happening in this case, and this is anticipating what's coming next, but just bear with me and look at the structure here, which has this weird property that there is a pro, but that essentially is the experiencer pro. And I put dative over there to sort of, if it was overt, then it would have had a dative marker on it, which is true when you move on to 39. So if you look at 39, it has a dative subject. There's no way to make that subject an ergative subject. Okay, so so compare 39 with 38. So now you get so the distinction is the light verb, right? The light verb in 38 is to do, which is transitive, so it allows for ergative. Here the light verb is unaccusative, and therefore it's not going to assign an ergative case. And I'm suggesting that this, again, going with the pattern that is following, follows the raising pattern. So the tree for that is the tree that follows 39, this little tree here. And what I'm suggesting here is that given that this is an experiencer noun, the subject gets a lexical dative in this case, which is true for, this is sort of a property that Hindi has. Experiencers assign lexical dative case to their subject, and that's what you see. And then under raising, that lexical case is preserved, and nothing else needs to be said. The only thing that needs to be stipulated here is that memory takes a dative subject. Okay? And this would be the object, which essentially then remains, remember, with unaccusative verb, that object is not going to get any case within the little VP. So it's left orphaned over there, and therefore it's at the mercy of a higher grammatical domain to assign it case. Okay? By either moving to the edge of the VP or whatever your favorite sort of account for such things is. There is an interesting puzzle that I don't have time to get into. There's that this object actually behaves unlike objects. It actually has subject properties. So if you test with your standard subject diagnostics, like licensing of pro in adjunct clauses and so on, it actually seems to behave like a subject, but so does the dative element here. It also behaves like a subject, except for the fact that it doesn't control, but it, in terms of binding and many other diagnostics, it behaves like a subject. So this sentence actually eventually ends up looking like some sort of double subject construction, which is sort of hard to analyze. It's a very puzzling domain, and it actually appears again and again with, in Hindi syntax, that you end up with these constructions where the object looks like a subject. In this case, of course, one of the diagnostics is that if you make the object a pronoun, for example, then it must have a DOM marking in Hindi, but it can't take that. And you do that and you've run into trouble. And that is, again, not negotiable in Hindi. Otherwise, objects, if they are human, especially if they're pronouns, then they must have a DOM marker. But this one cannot be a DOM. Okay. All right, so conclusion of, I should wrap up this section, that basically this light verb plays an important role in assigning inherent case. Crucial to differentiate it from what I just said. So light verbs assign inherent case, but they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't actually assign lexical case. Okay, so the difference here is between inherent and lexical, in the sense that lexical is completely thematically determined. Inherent is not. Okay, so basically you've seen that the name-marked subjects can be experiencer, for example. Okay, so therefore it looks like it's not going to be that the case that agentivity can actually give you the relevant text straightforwardly. Okay, so there are other things going on here. So inherent case is the sort of then responsibility of the light verb. Lexical case is actually the property of the heavy verb. Okay, so a heavy verb can assign lexical case, which is retained under movement. Okay, so that has to be assigned lower in the shell. And in order to sort of find if that's true or not, we have to go back to the VV compounds, which is what section 4 is about. But I'll let you read that at your leisure. Basically, you have to find psych predicates that take lexical subjects that are marked with dative and see if that stays put. And it does. Okay. The fact that light verbs are never psych verbs, I'm not sure if I have a. Okay, here's the observation. I think this is largely true. So I scanned through the list of all the light verbs in VV complex predicates and NV complex predicates, and there are no psych verbs there. You know, so psych verbs can't be light verbs. Okay? They can't be converted into a light verbs, and there is some obvious solution. I mean, here there's something that people who sort of understand argument structure better than I do, they can probably tell us in 2 minutes the deep reason is. I have ignored sort of in this talk saying anything about the aspectual distinctions introduced by various categories of light verbs. That wasn't sort of the domain that I was covering today. But I should make a sort of a note here that the light verbs in VV and light verbs in NV are quite distinct in those roles. So the light verbs in VV have some kind of aspectual notion of telicity that is necessarily there. So there are contexts that you can build where the light verb is either required or not permitted, right? So you can actually build frames where you can test. Those frames do not distinguish, I mean, they sort of will not actually apply to the NV light predicates. So if you sort of, so NV predicates are happy in the context in which VV predicates are not, okay? The aspectual context that, so that there's something additional to be said over there, which I haven't, and I don't fully know how to say that. So that's pretty much it. The conclusions are essentially that I've sort of suggested that there's complex structure involved, and I've tried to sort of make the distinctions in terms of raising and control. I have taken a dig at dependent case, saying that that's probably difficult to use as a theory of ergativity, at least in this domain. But nevertheless, there is an overlap of case properties across these two domains, which seems non-accidental. Thank you.